What would you say if I told you that your thoughts, your memories, and even your sense of self aren't being produced by your brain, that they are instead being received by your brain? And what if I told you that consciousness isn't something you generate, it's something you tune into? And what if I told you that right now you are just one node in a vast, invisible network? Scientists call this network structure the consciousness lattice. Hello, and welcome to the New Paranormal. I'm Professor Joseph Dent, and on this channel, we like to explore ideas that sit just outside the boundaries of mainstream science. Now, I'm not necessarily promoting any of these ideas, and I'm certainly not trying to debunk them. I just happen to find them fascinating, and my curiosity compels me to take a closer look. Today, we're going to take a look at one of the most intriguing new frameworks in consciousness research. The idea that consciousness might not be confined to the brain at all, but instead exists as a fundamental structure of reality, a structure that might be geometric, interconnected, and shared, a sort of cosmic lattice. For over a century, the dominant scientific view has been that consciousness is produced by the brain. Neurons fire, signals propagate, complexity increases, and somehow experience emerges. But there's a problem with this. Even today, scientists cannot explain how physical processes could possibly give rise to subjective experience. This is sometimes referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. We can map neural activity, and we can correlate brain states with thoughts and emotions, but correlation is not the same thing as an explanation. And that gap between brain activity and conscious experience has led some researchers to consider a pretty wild hypothesis. What if the brain doesn't produce consciousness? What if the brain is just interacting with consciousness? The consciousness lattice is not a single unified theory. It's more like a family of ideas that share a common intuition, that consciousness is structured like a network, a geometric, interconnected field. In this view, consciousness is fundamental, not emergent. The universe is embedded in a web of information, and individual minds are localized nodes within that web. Think of it less like a machine and more like a cosmic internet, where your brain is not the server, but the device accessing the network. One modern variation of this idea is sometimes described as a two-layer system. A user layer, your everyday conscious experience, and an admin layer, a deeper, non-local informational field. In this model, your waking self, the voice inside your head, your decisions, your perceptions, is just the interface. Behind it may exist a deeper level of awareness, one that is not confined to space and time in the same way. This could explain why certain altered states feel like accessing more information, why intuitive insights sometimes seem to appear fully formed, and why some people report experiences that feel, well, let's just say non-local. These interpretations are still highly speculative, and more research needs to be done. But they are valid attempts to describe something many people have experienced that we don't understand and which modern science has no answers for. Some researchers have tried to ground these ideas in physics and biology. One of the most well-known is the Orco-R theory proposed by Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. This theory suggests that consciousness may arise from quantum processes inside neurons, particularly within structures called microtubules. The idea is that these microscopic structures might interact with the deeper fabric of reality, possibly linking the brain to something more fundamental. Now, Orco-R is somewhat controversial. Many scientists remain skeptical of whether quantum coherence can be maintained in a warm, noisy environment like the brain. But what's interesting is not just whether or not it's correct, but that so much attention is being given to it by such serious minds. Another related idea comes from the work of Jacobo Grinberg, a neuroscientist who proposed something called the syntergic theory. Grinberg suggested that reality itself emerges from a kind of informational matrix, a field he believed connected all minds and matter. In his view, the brain doesn't create reality. It interacts with and organizes this underlying field. Consciousness, then, is not isolated. It is participatory. Each mind is shaping and being shaped by the same underlying structure, like multiple users editing the same shared document in real time. Now what's interesting is that this idea, this vision of reality as an interconnected network of nodes, is not entirely new. In fact, versions of it have appeared in philosophical traditions for centuries. One of the most striking examples comes from ancient Buddhist thought, a concept known as Indra's net. Indra's net is described as an infinite cosmic web stretching endlessly in every direction. At each intersection of the web sits a jewel, and each jewel reflects every other jewel in the network, not just once, but recursively. Each reflection contains all other reflections, an infinite regress, a universe mirrored within itself. The idea comes from the Amatamsaya Sutra, a foundational text in what later became Huanyan Buddhism, and it is used to illustrate something profound, that nothing exists independently, that every part of reality is connected to every other part, and that each part, in some sense, contains the whole. If you compare this ancient metaphor to modern ideas like the consciousness lattice, the parallels are hard to ignore. A network structure, nodes connected across space, information shared across the whole, and each point reflecting the total system. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that ancient traditions were describing quantum fields or neuroscience, but it does suggest something interesting, that across very different cultures and time periods, people have intuited a similar structure underlying reality. In Buddhist philosophy, this idea is sometimes described as interbeing, the notion that nothing exists in isolation. Everything arises in relationship to everything else. This connects two key ideas: dependent origination, that all phenomena arise together, and emptiness, not meaning nothing exists, but that nothing exists independently. In other words, what we think of as separate things may actually be expressions of a deeper shared structure. So where does that leave us? On one hand, we have modern theoretical models attempting to describe consciousness as a kind of network or field. On the other, we have ancient philosophical systems describing reality as an interconnected web of reflections. Are these the same thing? Probably not. Are they pointing in a similar direction? Quite possibly. If the consciousness lattice is even partially correct, then the implications are profound, because it would mean that consciousness is not something isolated inside individual brains, but something fundamentally shared, a structure we participate in rather than possess. And in that sense, the old metaphor of Indra's net may not just be poetic, it may be pointing towards something real, that every mind is a node, every node reflects the whole, and every boundary between self and other may be thinner than we think. Some versions of the consciousness lattice go even further, suggesting that the structure of reality itself might be geometric. Ideas like a face-centered cubic lattice underlying space, holographic models of the universe, information encoded in spatial relationship. In these models, matter is not the foundation, information is, and geometry is the language that organizes it. This aligns with a growing view in physics that the universe may be less like a collection of objects and more like a system of relationships. Now, it's important to pause here, because while these ideas are fascinating, they are not established scientific consensus. There is currently no direct evidence of a consciousness lattice, no confirmed mechanism for non-local awareness, and no unified theory that fully explains these phenomena. Skeptics would argue that these models may be metaphorical frameworks rather than literal structures, and that we should be cautious about drawing conclusions too quickly. And that's a fair point. But here's where things get interesting, because science progresses by asking better questions, and the consciousness lattice represents a shift in the question itself. Not how does matter create consciousness, but how does consciousness organize into the appearance of matter? That inversion changes everything, because if consciousness is fundamental, then we are not isolated observers in a dead universe. We are participants in something far more interconnected, something structured, something alive. And whether the consciousness lattice turns out to be a literal structure or a useful metaphor or something else entirely, it points toward a deeper possibility, that the boundaries between mind, matter, and reality itself may not be as solid as we once believed. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments. Do you think consciousness is something the brain produces or something it connects to? Until the next time, remember that I love you and stay furious. All power to the people.